Chapter 3. Maxim woke up and immediately felt that his head was heavy. The room was stuffy. They closed the window again at night. However, an open window is of little use either. The city is too close. During the day you can see a fixed brown hat of disgusting fumes above it. The wind carries them here, and neither the distance, nor the fifth floor, nor the park below helps. Now I'd like to take an ionic shower, Maxim thought, and jump out naked into the garden, not into this lousy, half-rotten, gray with burning, but into ours, somewhere near Leningrad, on the Karelian Isthmus, and run 15 kilometers around the lake at full speed, swim across the lake, and then walk across the lake for 20 minutes to exercise lightweight, climb among slippery underwater boulders. He jumped up, opened the window, leaned out in the drizzling rain, took a deep breath of damp air, coughed. The air was full of excess, and the raindrops left a metallic taste on his tongue. Cars were hissing and whistling along the freeway. Wet foliage glittered below the window, and broken glass shone on the high stone fence. A little man in a wet cape walked around the park, shoveling fallen leaves into a pile. Behind the veil of rain, one could vaguely see the brick buildings of a factory on the outskirts. As always, thick jets of toxic smoke crawled lazily from the two tall chimneys and crawled to the ground. A stuffy world. A troubled, painful world. He all seemed uncomfortable and dreary, like that public office where people with bright buttons and bad teeth suddenly started screaming, sitting down to wheeze out of the blue, and Guy, such a handsome guy, suddenly started beating red-bearded Zeph with blood, who he didn't even resist. A troubled world. A radioactive river, a ridiculous iron dragon, dirty air and unkempt passengers in an awkward 3-story metal box on wheels that emits bluish carbon monoxide smoke. And another wild scene, in the train, when some rude people, smelling of fusel oil for some reason, made an older woman laugh and gesture, and no one stood up for her. The car was full, but everyone was looking away, and only Guy suddenly jumped up, pale with anger or maybe fear, and shouted something to them, and they got away. A lot of anger, a lot of fear, a lot of irritation. They're all irritated and depressed here, sometimes irritated, sometimes depressed. Guy, obviously a kind and handsome man, sometimes became inexplicably furious, quarreled wildly with his roommates, looked at me like an animal, and then just as suddenly fell into deep prostration. And everyone on the train wasn't doing any better. They sat and lay quite peacefully for hours, talking softly, even laughing, and suddenly someone was grumbling at their neighbor. The neighbor snapped nervously. The others, instead of calming them down, got into a quarrel. The scandal was spreading, taking over the whole car, and now everyone was yelling at each other, threatening, pushing, and someone gets over their heads, waving their fists, and someone is held by the collar. The kids are crying at the top of their voices, their ears are cut off with irritation, and then everything gradually subsides. Everyone sulks at each other, talks reluctantly, turns away. And sometimes a scandal it turns into something completely obscene. Eyes come out of their orbits, faces turn red, voices scream loudly, and someone laughs hysterically, someone sings, someone prays with shaking hands above their heads. Crazy house. And bleak gray fields, smoky stations, poor villages, some untidy ruins sail melancholically past the windows, and skinny ragged women escort the train with sunken, dreary eyes. Maxim walked away from the window, stood a little in the middle of the cramped room, relaxed, feeling apathetic and mentally tired, then forced himself to pack himself up and stretched out a little, using a bulky wooden table as a projectile. It wouldn't take long to go down, he thought, concerned. I think I'll put up with another day or two, and then I'll have to run away, wander a little through the forests. It would be nice to run away to the mountains. The mountains here look glorious and wild. It's a little far, though. You can't turn around overnight. What did Guy call them? Zartak. I wonder if that's your own name or mountains in general? However, what mountains are there not up to me? I've been here 10 days and nothing has been done yet. He squeezed into the shower room and snorted and rubbed himself for several minutes under the heavy artificial rain, as disgusting as natural rain, a little colder, however, tough, calcareous, and, in addition, chlorinated, and even passed through metal pipes. He dried himself off with a disinfected towel and, unhappy with everything, on this muddy morning, with this stuffy world, and with his stupid situation, and with the excessively greasy breakfast he was about to eat, returned to his room to clean the bed, an ugly slatted iron structure with a striped, oiled pancake under a clean sheet. Breakfast had already been brought in. It was smoking and smelling on the table. The fish closed the window again. "Hello," Maxim told her in the local language. "Don't." "A window." "Hello," she replied, clicking numerous valves. "It is necessary. It's raining. It's bad." "Fish," Maxim said in German. Actually, her name was Nola, but Maxim christened her Fish from the very beginning for her general expression and equanimity. She turned around and looked at him with unblinking eyes. Then, for the umpteenth time, she put her finger to the tip of her nose and said, "Woman," then pointed her finger at Maxim, "Man," then at the tired robe hanging on the back of the chair, "Clothes. It is necessary." For some reason she couldn't see a man just wearing shorts. For some reason, she needed the man to wrap himself from foot to neck. He started getting dressed, and she made his bed, although Maxim always said that he would do it himself, pulled out the table into the middle of the room, which Maxim always pushed to the wall, decisively turned off the heating faucet, which Maxim always turned all the way, and all Maxim's monotonous don't crashed into her equally monotonous musts. Fastening his hoodie at his neck with a single broken button, Maxim went to the table and picked breakfast up with a two-toothed fork. The usual dialogue took place. "I don't want to." "Don't." "It is necessary." "Food." "Breakfast." "I don't want breakfast. It doesn't taste good." "I need breakfast." "Yummy." "A fish," Maxim said to her soulfully. "You are a cruel person. If you came to my earth, I would crash to pieces, but I would find you food to your liking." "I don't understand," she said with regret. "What is fish?" Chewing on a fat piece with disgust, Maxim took the paper and painted a full-face picture of bream. She carefully studied the drawing and put it in her robe pocket. She took all the drawings that Maxim made and took them somewhere. Maxim drew a lot, willingly and with pleasure, in his spare time and at night when he couldn't sleep. There was absolutely nothing to do here. He drew animals and humans, drew tables and diagrams, and reproduced anatomical cuts. He portrayed Professor Mega as looking like a hippopotamus and a hippopotamus like Professor Mega. He drew universal Linkosis tables, machine diagrams and diagrams of historical sequences. He tortured loads of paper, and all this disappeared into Pisces's pocket with no apparent consequences for the contact procedure. Professor Megu, aka Behemoth, had his own method and had no intention of giving it up. Behemoth was not interested in the universal Linkosis table, which should begin any contact with. Only Riba taught the alien the local language, and even then only for the convenience of communication, so that he would close the window and not walk around without a robe. Experts were not involved in the contact at all. Behemoth was engaged in Maxim, and only Behemoth. However, he had a fairly powerful research tool at his disposal, the metascopic technique, and Maxim spent 14 to 16 hours a day in a stand chair. Moreover, Behemoth's metascope was good. It allowed us to penetrate deeply into memories and had a very high resolution. With such a car, it was possible, perhaps, to do without knowing the language. But Behemoth used the metascope in a weird way. He refused to show his metagrams categorically and even with some indignation, and treated Maxim's metagrams in a peculiar way. Maxim specially developed a whole program of memories that were supposed to give the Aborigines a fairly complete picture of the social, economic and cultural life of the Earth. However, Behemoth was not enthusiastic about metagrams of this kind. The hippopotamus twisted his face, mooed, walked away, started making phone calls, or, sitting down at the table, started sawing the assistant tediously, often repeating the juicy word Masaraksh. On the other hand, when Maxim blew up an ice rock that crushed the ship on the screen, smashed a carapace wolf to shreds, or took the express laboratory away from a giant stupid pseudo-octopus, Behemoth was as far away from the metascope. He screamed softly, clapped his bald head happily, and yelled menacingly at the exhausted assistant who was watching the recording of the image. The professor was so delighted with the sight of the chromospheric prominence as if he had never seen anything like it in his life, and he really liked the love scenes, borrowed mainly from movies to give the Aborigines some idea of the emotional life of mankind. Such a ridiculous attitude towards the material made Maxim think sad. It seemed that Behemoth was not a professor at all, but simply a metascopic engineer preparing material for an authentic contact committee, with whom Maxim would yet meet, and it was unknown when this would happen. Then it turned out that Behemoth was a rather primitive person, like a boy who in war and peace is only interested in battle scenes. This was offending. Maxim represented Earth and, honestly, had reason to count on a more serious contact partner. However, one could assume that this world is located at the crossroads of unknown interstellar routes and aliens are not uncommon here. It is not uncommon to such an extent that special authoritative commissions are no longer created here for the sake of every newcomer, but simply siphon out the most effective information from him, and that's all. This assumption was supported by the speed with which people with light-colored buttons, clearly not specialists, understood the situation and, without any aches or oohs, sent the alien right to its destination. Or maybe some non-humanoids who have been here before left such a bad memory that now the Aborigines treat everything alien with a certain and justified distrust, and then all the fuss that Professor Behemoth makes around the metascope is only the appearance of contact, a delay in time until some high authorities decide my fate. One way or another, Maxim decided, choking on the last bite. We need to learn the language as soon as possible, and then everything will be clear. All right, Riba said, taking his plate. Let's go. Maxim sighed and got up. They went out into the hallway. The corridor was long, dirty blue, with rows of closed doors on the right and left, exactly like the door to Maxim's room. Maxim never met anyone here, but twice he heard some strange excited voices from behind the door. Perhaps aliens were also held there, waiting for a decision on their fate. The fish was walking ahead like a big man, straight as a stick, and Maxim suddenly felt very sorry for her. This country apparently did not yet know the beauty industry, and poor fish was left to her own devices. With this liquid, colorless hair sticking out from under a white hat, with this huge shoulder blades protruding under the robe, with ugly skinny legs, it was probably impossible to feel on top, except with alien creatures, and even then with non-humanoid ones. The professor's assistant treated her disdainfully, but Behemoth didn't notice her at all and referred to her no less than SS, which probably corresponded to his intercosmic Maxim remembered his own, God knows what to do with her, and felt remorse. He caught up with her, patted her bony shoulder and said, "Well done, Nola is good." She looked up to him dry and looked like a full face like a surprised bream like never before. She took his hand away, moved her barely visible eyebrows, and announced sternly, "Maxim is not good. A man. A woman. Don't." Maxim got embarrassed and fell behind again. So they got to the end of the corridor, Riba pushed the door open, and they found themselves in a large, bright room, which Maxim called the waiting room to himself. The windows here were tastelessly decorated with a rectangular grid of thick iron bars. A tall, leather-covered door led to Behemoth's laboratory, and for some reason, this door always sat two very tall, sedentary Aborigines who did not respond to greetings and were in a constant trance. As always, the fish went straight to the lab, leaving Maxim in the waiting room. Maxim, as always, greeted him. As always, they did not answer him. The door to the laboratory remained ajar, with Behemoth's loud, irritated voice and the ringing click of the mentoscope on. Maxim went to the window, looked for some time at the misty, What landscape, at the wooded plain cut by the highway, at the tall metal tower, barely visible in the fog, quickly got bored and, without waiting for a call, entered the laboratory. As usual, there was a pleasant smell of ozone here, duplicate screens were flickering, and a bald, dead assistant with an unmemorable name and the nickname floor lamp pretended to tune the equipment, but in fact he was listening to the scandal with interest. There was a scandal in the lab. In Behemoth's chair, a stranger with a square, scaly face and red puffy eyes sat at Behemoth's table. The hippopotamus stood in front of him with his legs apart, his arms resting on his sides and leaning slightly. He was yelling. His neck was blue, his bald head flamed with sunset purple, and splashes flew from his mouth far in all directions. Trying not to draw attention to himself, Maxim quietly walked to his workplace and greeted his assistant softly. The floor lamp, a nervous creature, jumped off in horror and slipped on the thick cable. Maxim barely had time to grab him by the shoulders, and the poor floor lamp went limp, rolling his eyes. There wasn't a blood left in his face. He was a strange man, he was scared to the point of convulsions of Maxim. From somewhere, a fish appeared inaudibly with an uncorked bottle, which was immediately held to the floor lamp's nose. The floor lamp hiccuped and came to life. Before he slipped back into oblivion, Maxim leaned him against the iron cupboard and hurriedly walked away. Sitting in the poster chair, he found that the scaly stranger had stopped listening to Behemoth and was looking closely at him. Maxim. Maxim smiled kindly. The stranger tilted his head slightly. Then Behemoth gasped his fist across the table with a terrible miserable sound and clutched his phone. Taking advantage of the pause, the stranger said a few words, of which Maxim made out only should and not, picked up a piece of thick bluish paper with a bright green border from the table and waved to it in the air in front of Hippopotamus. The hippopotamus brushed it off annoyingly and immediately started barking at the phone. It is necessary, not necessary, and the incomprehensible Masaraksh were falling out of him like from a horn of plenty, and Maxim also caught the word window. It all ended when Hippopotamus threw his earphone in irritation, barked at the stranger several more times, spitting him from head to toe, and rolling out, slamming the door. Then the stranger wiped his face with a handkerchief, got up from his chair, opened the long flat box that lay on the windowsill, and took out some dark clothes from it. "Come here," he said to Maxim. "Get dressed." Maxim looked back at Ribba. "Go on," Ribba said. "Get dressed. It is necessary." Maxim realized that his life was finally taking a long-awaited turn, that someone had decided something somewhere. Forgetting Pisces's instructions, he immediately took off his ugly hoodie and, with the help of a stranger, put on a new outfit. In Maxim's opinion, this garment was neither beautiful nor comfortable, but it was exactly the same as worn by a stranger. One could even assume that the stranger donated his own spare attire, because the sleeves of the jacket were short, and the pants were hanging in the back in a bag and falling down. However, everyone else present liked Maxim's look in his new clothes. The stranger grumbled something approving. Ribba, softening his facial features as much as possible for Bream, stroked Maxim's shoulders and pulled off his jacket, and even the floor lamp smiled pale as he took refuge behind the remote control. "Come on," said the stranger and headed for the door, which the angry Behemoth rolled out. "Goodbye," Maxim said to Ryby. "Thank you," he added in German. "Goodbye," Ribba replied. "Maxim is good. It's healthy. It is necessary." She seemed to be moved. Or maybe she's concerned that the suit doesn't fit well. Maxim waved to the pale floor lamp and hurried after the stranger. They walked through several rooms filled with awkward archaic equipment, took the thunderous and clanging elevator to the first floor, and found themselves in the vast low lobby, where Guy had brought Maxim a few days ago. And like a few days ago, I had to wait again for some papers to be written, for a funny little man in a ridiculous headdress scratching something on pink letterheads, and a red-eyed stranger scratched something on green letterheads, and a girl with optical amplifiers in front of her eyes makes purple prints on these forms, and then everything changes into forms and prints, and gets confused and they shout at each other and grab the phone. And finally the little man in a ridiculous headdress takes 2 green and 1 pink letterhead, and he tears the pink form in half and he gives half to the girl making the prints, and the scaly stranger receives 2 pink letterheads, a thick blue cardboard and a round metal badge with an inscription engraved on it. And a minute later he gives it all to a tall man with light-colored buttons standing at the exit door, 20 steps away from the little man in a ridiculous hat, and when they are already outside, the tall man suddenly starts screaming hoarsely, and the red-eyed stranger comes back again, and it turns out that he forgot to pick up the blue cardboard box, and he takes the blue cardboard box and with a deep sigh, he pushes him into her bosom. Only after that, Maxim, who has already got wet, gets the opportunity to get into an irrationally long car to the right side of the red-eyed man, who is irritated, puffs and often repeats Behemoth's favorite spell, Masaraksh. The car grumbled, started softly, got out of the fixed herd of other cars, empty and wet, rolled along the large paved area in front of the building, went around a huge flower bed with sluggish flowers, past a high yellow wall covered with broken glass over the top, rolled out onto the highway and stopped sharply. Masaraksh, the red-eyed man hissed again and turned off the engine. A long column of identical spotted trucks with crooked, curved iron bodies stretched along the highway. Rows of fixed rounded objects protruded above the iron sides, glowing moistly with metal. The trucks moved slowly, maintaining the right intervals, bubbling steadily with engines and spreading the terrible stench of organic fumes. Maxim looked at the door from his side, realized what was going on, and raised the window. The red-eyed man, without looking at him, uttered a long phrase that turned out to be completely incomprehensible. "I don't understand," Maxim said. The red-eyed man turned his surprised face towards him and, judging by his intonation, asked him something. Maxim shook his head. "I don't understand," he repeated. The red-eyed man seemed even more surprised. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a flat box full of long white sticks, put one stick in his mouth, and offered the others to Maxim. Out of courtesy, Maxim accepted the box and began to look at it. The box was made of cardboard and smelled pungent of some dry plants. Maxim took one of the sticks, bit off a piece and chewed it. Then he hurriedly lowered the glass, leaned out and spat. It wasn't food. "Don't," he said, returning the box to the red-eyed man. "It doesn't taste good." The red-eyed man looked at him with half his mouth open. The white stick stuck to him and hung on his lip. In accordance with local rules, Maxim touched the tip of his nose with his finger and introduced himself, "Maxim." The red-eyed man muttered something, and suddenly he had a twinkle in his hand. He immersed the end of a white stick into it, and immediately the car was filled with nauseating smoke. "Masaraksh!" Maxim shouted indignantly and opened the door. "Don't!" He knew what those sticks were. In the train where they were traveling with Guy, almost all men poisoned the air with exactly the same smoke, but for this they did not use white sticks, but short and long wooden objects that looked like ancient children's whistles. They were inhaling some kind of drug. The custom was undoubtedly the most harmful, and then, on the train, Maxim took comfort only in the fact that the handsome Guy was, apparently, also categorically against this custom. The stranger hurriedly threw the drug stick out the window and for some reason waved his palm to his face. Just in case, Maxim also waved his palm and then introduced himself again. It turned out that the red-eyed man's name was Funk, and that's why the conversation stopped. For about 5 minutes they sat looking at each other favorably, and, one by one, pointing each other to the endless convoy of trucks, chanted, "Masaraksh." Then the endless column ran out and Funk made it onto the highway. He was probably in a hurry. In any case, he immediately made the engine roar like a velvet roar, then turned on some vile howling device and, in Maxim's opinion, not following any safety rules, drove overtaking the convoy along the highway, barely able to dodge the cars that were rushing towards him. They overtook a convoy of trucks, almost flew to the side of the road, around the wide red carriage with a lonely, very wet driver, slipped past a wooden wagon on swirling wheels with spokes, attracted by wet fossil animals, held a group of pedestrians in canvas cloaks into the ditch, flew under the shadow of huge sprawling trees, flat landed in rows on either side of the road. Funk kept increasing his speed, the oncoming airflow roared in fairings, and the crews in front, frightened by howling, snuggled against the roadsides, giving way. Maxim thought the car was not suitable for such speeds, too unstable, and he felt a little uncomfortable. Soon, houses surrounded the road, a car broke into town, and Funk was forced to slow down sharply. Then, with Guy, Maxim was driving from the station in a large public car full of passengers beyond measure. His head rested against the low ceiling, everyone around him was swearing and smoking, his neighbors were mercilessly stepping on his feet, resting on his sides with some solid corners. It was late in the evening, the windows, which had not been washed for a long time, were covered with mud and dust, and they reflected the dim light of the interior lights, and Maxim never saw the city. Now he got a chance to see it. The streets were disproportionately narrow and literally packed with carriages. Funk's car was barely woven, clenched on all sides by a wide variety of mechanisms. In front, blocking half the sky, the back wall of the van was piled up, covered with ludicrous colorful inscriptions and rude images of people and animals. On the left, two identical cars, full of gesticulating men and women, crawled without overtaking or falling behind. Beautiful women, bright, not like Pisces. A kind of electric train roared further to the left, with a thunder of iron, flashing blue and green sparks minute by minute. Its daughter was filled with passengers hanging in clusters from all the doors. On the right was the sidewalk, a fixed strip of asphalt that was prohibited for traffic. People in wet gray and black clothes walked in a thick stream along the sidewalk, collided, overtook each other, dodged each other, squeezed their shoulders forward, ran through the open, brightly lit doors every now and then, mixed with the crowd swarming behind the huge foggy windows, and sometimes suddenly gathered in large groups, creating traffic jams and whirlpools. Pulling my neck, looking somewhere. There were a lot of thin and pale faces here, very similar to Pisces's. Almost all of them were ugly, excessively, unhealthy, too pale, awkward, and angular. But they gave the impression of happy people. They laughed often and willingly, they behaved at ease, their eyes glittered, and loud, lively voices were everywhere. Perhaps this is more of a prosperous world after all, Maxim thought. In any case, although the streets are dirty, they are not littered with garbage, and the houses also look quite cheerful. Almost all windows are lit on the occasion of twilight, which means that they do not have a shortage of electricity. Advertisements sparkle a lot of fun, and as for drowned people, with this level of street noise and so much air pollution, it's hard to expect anything else. The world is poor, unsettled, not quite healthy. And yet it looks quite prosperous. Suddenly something changed outside. There were excited screams. A man climbed onto a lamppost and, hanging from it, began to scream vigorously, waving his free hand. They sang on the sidewalk. People stopped, tore off their hats, rolled out their eyes and sang, screaming until they wheezed, raising their narrow faces to the huge colorful inscriptions that suddenly flashed across the street. Masaraksh, Funk hissed, and the car swung. Maxim looked at it. The Funk was deathly pale and his face distorted. Shaking his head, he could hardly take his hand off the wheel and stared at his watch. Masaraksh. He groaned and said a few more words, from which Maxim only recognized "I don't understand." Then he looked over his shoulder, and his face became even more distorted. Maxim also looked back, but there was nothing special behind him. A closed, bright yellow car was moving there, as square as a box. They were already screaming unbearably outside, but Maxim was not up to it. Funk was clearly losing consciousness. As the car kept moving, the van in front slowed down, its beacons flashed, and suddenly the smudged wall moved. There was a disgusting gnashing sound, a dull blow, and the distorted hood stood on end. "Funk!" Maxim shouted. Funk! Don't! Funk lay with his hand and head on the oval wheel and groaned loudly, often. Brakes were screaming all around, traffic stopped, signals were howling. Maxim shook Funk by the shoulder, threw it away, opened the door and leaned out and shouted in German, "Here! He's not feeling well." A singing, screaming, rumbling crowd had already gathered in front of the car, their arms were waving vigorously, their fists were shaking above their heads, dozens of pairs of filled eyes were spinning wildly in orbits. Maxim understood absolutely nothing, either they were outraged by the accident, or they were happy about something without memory, or threatening someone. It was useless to shout, you couldn't hear yourself, and Maxim returned to Funk again. Now he was lying back with his face thrown back, rubbing his temples, cheeks and skull with all his might with his hands, and saliva was bubbling on his lips. Maxim realized that he was in unbearable pain and took him firmly by the elbows, hurriedly straining himself, getting ready to pour the pain into himself. He wasn't sure if this would happen to a creature on another planet. He searched and couldn't find nerve contact, and then, in addition, Funk, taking his hands off his temples, began to push Maxim into the chest with all his little strength, muttering something desperately in a crying voice. Maxim only understood, "Go, go." It was clear that Funk was out of his mind. Then the door next to Funk opened, two hot faces slipped into the car under black berets, rows of metal buttons flashed, and immediately many firm, strong hands took Maxim by the shoulders, sides, neck, ripped him off Funk and pulled him out of the car. He didn't resist, they had no threat or ill intent in their hands, quite the opposite. Stranded into the rumbling crowd, he saw two in berets lead the bent, crooked Funk to the yellow car, and three others in berets pushed the men waving their arms away from him. Then the crowd roared around the maimed car, the car started moving awkwardly, got up, turned sideways, slowly spinning rubber wheels flashed through the air, and now it was rooftop lying down, and the crowd was climbing on it, and everyone was screaming and singing, and everyone was filled with some furious joy. They pushed Maxim against the wall of the house, pressed him against a wet glass window, and, with his neck stretched out, he saw over his head how a yellow square car, making a copper scream, moved, sparkled with many bright lights, squeezed through the crowd of people and cars, and disappeared from sight.